I've been there scrolling through endless listings of plasma cutters that promise perfect cuts every time, only to get a machine that sputters, drifts, or just can't keep up when you actually need it on a production job. The frustration is real, especially when you're a small shop owner or a hobbyist who can't afford to waste time and material on a tool that sounds great on paper but falls flat in the shop. That's why I'm digging into the POWEREDGE80 today, because a lot of the hype around 80-amp cutters can hide some practical trade-offs that only show up once you fire it up. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the POWEREDGE80 is positioned as a CNC cutter, which immediately raises the question, will it actually integrate smoothly with a typical desktop CNC table, or will I end up fighting firmware quirks and power supply mismatches? From the specs you can see it runs on 220-volt single-phase power and advertises a 100% duty cycle at its full 80-amp rating. In plain English, that means you can, in theory, run it continuously without the cutter forcing you to pause and cool down. For a shop that does a lot of repeated cuts, think automotive brackets, steel art pieces, or small batch production, that constant runtime can be a real time saver. But the real proof is in how it behaves when you put a piece of inch-mild steel under the torch. The first thing I noticed was the LCD display. It's bright enough to read in a bright workshop, and it actually shows the voltage and current in real time, which is handy when you're trying to stay within the sweet spot for a specific material thickness. The display isn't a novelty, it lets you fine-tune the cut on the fly, something you can't do with older models that just have a static dial. If you're the kind of maker who likes to run a CNC router and a plasma cutter side by side, the CNC Table Ready claim is a big draw. The cutter's output connector is a standard IEC plug, and the control input is a 5-pin connector that many popular CNC controllers already support. I set it up with a code controller I already had from a previous router project, and the handshaking was straightforward, no firmware flashing required. That said, the machine does expect a clean 220V supply, so if your shop only has 110V outlets you'll need a transformer, which adds cost and space. That's a hidden trade-off that can trip up someone who's only looking at the headline amps. Now, who should actually consider spending on this cutter? If you're running a small fabricator that needs to cut inch steel on a regular basis, the 80-amp capacity gives you enough power to get clean pierce points without having to preheat or slow the feed too much. The fact that it can sustain a full-duty cut means you won't be forced into a cut-then-cool-down rhythm, which can double the time it takes to finish a batch of parts. For hobbyists who only cut thin sheet metal a few times a month, the machine might be overkill. A 50-amp cutter would likely handle most DIY projects and would be lighter on the wallet and the power requirements. In terms of practical strengths, the torch itself feels solid. The air cutter nozzle is the standard size, which means you can buy replacement nozzles at any hardware store without hunting for a proprietary part. The consumables are also widely available. The electrode and the copper tip aren't locked into a Brandonly ecosystem. That translates to lower ongoing costs, which is something I always keep an eye on because the cutter's initial price tag can be deceptive if you're not factoring in the consumable turnover. A weakness that shows up after a few hours of use is the heat management of the internal power supply. Even though the spec says 100% duty cycle, I noticed the unit getting noticeably warm after an hour of continuous cutting. It didn't shut down, but the ambient temperature in the shop rose enough that I had to open a window to keep the overall environment comfortable. If your shop is already hot or you're planning to run the cutter in a confined space, that extra heat could be a nuisance. Another practical consideration is the weight. At roughly 45 pounds, it's not a piece you'll toss onto a tabletop and forget about. You'll need a sturdy workbench or a dedicated mounting plate. The benefit, however, is that the mass helps dampen vibration during a cut, which can improve the straightness of a line when you're feeding the torch manually. For a CNC setup, that stability can reduce the need for fine-tuning the feed rate to compensate for wobble. One thing that sometimes catches new buyers off guard is the air requirement. The cutter needs a steady flow of compressed air, and while most shops already have a shop air line, the flow rate it recommends is on the higher side. If your compressor is borderline on capacity, you might see the arc become unstable, especially when cutting thicker material. That's